A Trip into the Darkness. Chapter 29. Fear and dread made her feel like she was drowning, and that she could not breathe. This was it. He was going to get her and drag her back to his lair by her hair. She could not stop him as he bound her weak, aching body in chains. No, please, do not do this. She wanted to scream, but she could not make the words come out. He had somehow managed to take her voice. How had he taken her voice? No, she tried to beg. No, please, no, don't. Don't. Tilda. The sound of her name and the painful sound of screaming awoke Mallory from her nightmare. Sitting up in the bed, she realized she was the one making the horrible screaming sound. Making herself stop, she found her ears were ringing and there was a calming, strong energy flowing into her body, helping her tight muscles relax. It's okay, Mallory. You're safe. No one can hurt you here. Andres was whispering to her from one side of the bed. Panting, she reached up, wiped her hands on her face. She must have been sobbing in her sleep. I'm okay, she rasped. Her throat hurt and her arms were sticky. Glancing down, she saw red smears of blood and gashes on her arms. She must have clawed herself. She remembered trying to claw her attacker in her dreams. What time is it? She asked, feeling embarrassed that she had been screaming like a lunatic while she slumbered. It's just after 2 in the morning. Do you want some water? Andres asked her. She nodded her head and he stood up from the bed. I'll be right back, he told her and then left the room. Jumping up, she went to the bathroom to wash the blood off herself. The wounds on her arms were already healing. A perk of being well fed, she assumed as she made her way back to the bed. Before she got there, Andres walked back into the room with a glass in his hand and Mallory lost her breath when she looked at him. The half moon was shining brightly through her windows and lit him up like he was on stage at a night show. He had on a pair of black sweatpants that were hanging low on his hips and nothing else. His chest and stomach muscles were chiseled like a sculpture of a Roman warrior or a god. His shoulders were wide and layered with fine muscle definition. Glancing back down at his abs, she found that he did have the happy trail that she had envisioned him to have. Glancing lower, she could see his long length hanging down through his sweatpants. She wanted to fall at her knees and beg him to fuck her. Looking back at his face, she thought his eyes might have dilated. He was also looking at her, and she knew she was not nearly as desirable as he was with her still starved body. Even when she had ran every day and eaten whenever she was hungry, could never have compared to a man like him. She had never been with a man like him or any before. Someone who was so full of strength and whose body spoke of power and control. It made her ache and throb in all the right places. He must have seen where her thoughts were going because he cleared his throat and looked away before holding out her glass of water for her to take. Your water. Do you need me to get you anything else? He looked strained and desperate to leave. Taking the glass from him, she was careful to avoid touching his hand. No, thank you. Good night, Andres. With a nod, he turned and left her room quickly. Mallory stood there for a moment, and sadness seeped in. She shouldn't feel sad that he left, but she did. Drinking her water, she crawled back into bed. She hadn't expected to be able to fall back asleep, but within minutes she was out. Tilda. The second time she awoke, it was to a light knock on her door frame. Opening her eyes, Mallory looked at the open door and found him standing there with a small smile pulling at one side of his face. Good morning, Blue Eyes, he said. Sitting up, she yawned and stretched her arms over her head. Buenos dias, Andres, she told him in return. A real smile spread across his face. He said something long and fast in Spanish. The flow of his words sounded like music to her ears. Cocking her head to the side, she tried to make sense of what he had just told her. She wasn't positive, but it sounded like he might have called her pretty, and something about love, maybe? Lifting an eyebrow, she stared at him in confusion. What did you say? Someday I will tell you. He responded, and Mallory snorted as she threw the covers off her body and got up. Andre stepped into her room and asked, Are you hungry? If you're ready, I'll feed you before breakfast. Her mouth immediately started to throb, and her throat became scratchy with the mention of his delectable blood. She wanted to tell him that he did not have to feed her every day, but that would be a lie. She wanted his blood every day for the rest of eternity. Glancing down at her body, she felt almost naked in her little black nightie. He had already dressed for the day in his normal attire. Yes, but hold on a minute, she said, dropping to her knees to look through the bags of clothes they had bought last night. When she found what she was looking for, she stood up and wrapped the black silk robe around herself, something that she had definitely not picked out but was happy to have nonetheless. Feeling self-conscious, Mallory looked back at Andres and waited for him to make the first move. He must have recognized her shyness because he slowly approached her. When he was a mere inch away, he reached down and grabbed her hands. Mallory hissed. The contact with his skin shot energy throughout her body, making her tingle all over. He pulled her hands up to his head, then leaned himself down towards her face. Closing her eyes, she let instinct take over as she took his lower neck in her mouth. Life, power, strength, and euphoria rushed into her as she nursed from him. It was also accompanied by a raging lust. The tightness in her belly and the ache between her legs made it hard to concentrate on his blood. She wanted to move her hands out of his hair and grab him in other places, but she would not overstep his boundaries, even though she wanted to so badly. Breaking away from his neck, she stopped feeding much sooner than previous times she had drank from him. His aura and blood set her on fire, and she needed him inside of her. Obviously, her self-control was dearly lacking. A memory of how she had nearly begged Troy to fuck her when she was his captive popped into her head and made her stomach clench in distress. No, she certainly could not trust herself, and she didn't want to make him uncomfortable, so she licked his wound and took a step back. Panting, she met Andres's dark golden eyes. He looked slightly confused, and he reached out a hand and gently touched her face. Mallory closed her eyes and leaned her head into his open palm. She felt his thumb rub over her lower lip and then move into her mouth. She tasted a drop of his blood that must have still been on her lips, while her aching body screamed at her for more. More of his time, more of his blood, more of his touch. She could feel her nipples straining through the thin layers of silk, and the friction rubbing on them almost made her fall to her knees. Andres whispered something in Spanish, and Mallory opened her eyes. He had a frown pulling at his beautiful face. Then, with a heavy sigh, he dropped his hands from her skin and took a small step back. Mallory immediately felt cold without him touching her. He took another step back and said, "I will see you downstairs for breakfast, baby girl." Then he turned around and stormed out of her room. I desperately need a release, she thought as she rubbed her tired eyes. Mallory did not know what time it was, but there was no way she was going to be able to sit beside him and make small talk in this condition. With that, she stripped out of her clothes and went to the bathroom to take a cold shower. As the ice water seeped into her skin, it helped to chase away some of her lust. Glancing down at her vagina, she swore the thing was pulsing with the beat of her heart. Damn this body, she thought as she reached down to touch herself. The image of Andres from last night and only his sweatpants popped into her head. She imagined rubbing her hands on his chest and going up on her toes to kiss him. The image of him fucking her mouth with his tongue had her panting harder. She had barely worked a third finger inside of herself before an orgasm tore through her body. Biting her arm to keep from moaning aloud, she continued to move her fingers inside of herself until she felt another release build. Panting, she fucked herself harder and fell against the shower door when the next orgasm filled her and her vagina walls clamped down around her slender fingers. Pulling her fingers out, she rinsed them under the icy water. The tension eased some, but she still felt horny. Deciding that she could not hide in the shower all morning, she turned off the water and got out. Walking over to her bag of clothes, she pulled out a pair of black skimpy shorts and a lacy pink top. With a deep breath to center herself, she went downstairs and walked into the kitchen. Andres was already seated at the kitchen island. He was tense and was sitting up straight in his chair. Taking a seat beside him, he did not turn and look at her, or even acknowledge her. He seemed angry, with his eyebrows pulled down in a frown. Biting her lip, she picked up her glass of juice and took a drink. Sophia turned around from the stove and saw Mallory. A huge smile spread across her tan, wrinkled face. "Buenos dias, Mallory. Did you have a good evening?" Walking over to the island, she sat down a plate of food on the granite countertop. "Buenos dias, Sophia, and yes, it was a pleasant evening. I got to ride on Andres' boat, and we went shopping and got cupcakes." Andres finally looked at her, and he didn't look quite as angry, but he still didn't seem happy. She wondered what she had done to upset him. He had seemed fine early in her room. "Oh, that sounds lovely, dear. I've always loved shopping," Sophia told her as she picked up more plates to bring to the table. "How was your night?" Mallory asked the woman. "It was nice. Me and Charles went home and cooked a little dinner before we watched a movie with Fred. Fred is our dog, you see, and he is a very needy little mutt," Sophia told her. Mallory smiled as she envisioned Sophia and her dog. "Who is Charles?" Charles is my husband, dear. He works here. I'll have to introduce the two of you sometime. Yes, that would be nice, Mallory told her while adding food to her plate. During Sophia and Mallory's conversation, Andres had not moved or relaxed. After she had a plate full, she handed it to him. He raised a single black eyebrow before taking the plate. How was your shower? He finally asked, continuing to stare at her. Mallory's face felt hot as she looked at her hands. It was cold, I guess. That's interesting. I could have sworn I felt 2 waves of heat coming down the stairs. Mallory coughed on her food and dropped her fork. Taking a drink of her juice, her face felt like it was on fire. No way he could have felt her masturbate, unless he had felt her pulling at his energy or something. When the front door opened, she heard 2 heartbeats walking into the house, and she tensed. Their energies were strong and chaotic, like Morgan's aura had been. Andre saw her reaction and said, "Do not worry, they work for me." The 2 men stepped into the kitchen then. They both looked of Spanish descent and were tall. The man on the left had a beard, flecks of gray in his black hair. The other man was clean-shaven and looked like he could model for a living. Turning towards them, Andres smiled and said, "Mallory, I want to introduce you to the head of security and my close friends." Andres motioned first to the man on the left who had flecks of gray in his hair. "This is Guerrero, head of my security and one of my oldest friends. Whenever I leave, he runs the island and keeps things in order." Guerrero smiled at her and nodded his head. She was relieved when he didn't try and shake her hand. She could feel his energy easy enough without having to touch him. Next, Andres motioned to the younger guy and said, "This is Guerrero's nephew, Nicholas, who moved here from Spain about 100 years ago. He often accompanies me on business trips, and I would consider him to be my second in charge." "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mallory," Nicholas told her in a very thick accent. Mallory smiled at both the men. She wondered why Andres thought it was important that she meet them. "If you ever need anything and can't get in contact with me, then you can trust either of these 2 men to help," Andres said, nodding at his companions. Taking the hint, Curro and Nicholas turned around and left the house. Mallory lifted her eyebrows and looked at him. Clearing his throat, he reached down under the island and picked up a large white bag. "You asked me last night if the cupcakes are the only errand I had to run. I told you no because I was also retrieving these." He handed her the bag, and only because she was curious did she take it from him. Opening it, she reached in and pulled out a laptop. Sitting on the table, she reached back into the bag and retrieved a cell phone. "What is this?" Mallory asked, frowning at the new electronics. "I figured you might want contact with the outside world while you stay here. I programmed the phone and the computer last night and downloaded Microsoft on the laptop. They are both connected to the Wi-Fi, and the phone now has my phone number in it, along with Sophia's, Guerrero's, and Nicholas's." Mallory felt tears burning her eyes, and she bit her bottom lip as she tried not to cry. "There is also a new journal in the bag. I figured you might want another one." Looking at Andres, she tried to figure out his strategy. Did he think if he gave her these things, she wouldn't demand that he lets her leave? She had told him last night that she had to finish what was started. There was nothing he could do to make her stay here. "I can't accept these." "You mentioned you had been attending online college before coming here. Just know you are welcome to stay on this island for as long as you want, and perhaps you could enroll back in school if it pleased you. I could even loan you money if you need financial support to get back into school. I'm sure after you make it big with being an author, you'll pay me back if you decide." He told her, and she felt cold, angry malice shoot throughout her body. The thing at her neck screeched an angry "no" inside of her head, causing an intense headache to spread behind her eyes. Black spots danced in her vision. Holding back her flinch from the sudden pain, she told him, "I can't do that, Andres. Even if I wanted to, I can't." The anger emitting from the amulet was even making her feel nauseous. Instead of responding or trying to argue with her as she expected, he simply nodded his hand and looked away from her. Releasing a deep breath, he stood up from the table. Turning to Sophia, he thanked her for breakfast and started to walk out of the kitchen. When he was multiple paces away, he stopped and looked back at her. He looked strained and unhappy, and maybe even sad. "When you decide to leave, they will be like everything else and can go with you. Now, if you'll excuse me, I must be getting to work, and I will see you again for dinner." Andre started to walk out of the room, but Mallory jumped out of her chair. "Wait." He turned around and looked at her. Licking her lips, she told him, "Thank you." A smile pulled at his lips before he turned back around and left the house.